Welcome back to Punk Rock Theologian. Continuing through the book, our next chapter is Joseph, the story of a spoiled rich kid who gets a fancy coat and goes through a really rough season before he ends up becoming like the second most powerful person in the world. Today, I want to look at the concept of identity. And in Joseph's life, that really played out in his clothing. The first step is probably the most famous one, because Joseph's father, Jacob, loves him more than his 11 older brothers, which, not surprisingly, leads to some issues between them. But rather than be at all subtle about it, Genesis 37:3 says, "One day Jacob had a special gift made for Joseph, a beautiful robe, but his brothers hated Joseph because their father loved him more than the rest of them." Now, about this robe, I especially like that the New Living Translation just calls it a beautiful robe, because we don't specifically know what was special about it. We know it was fancy. Regardless of what the robe looks like, it is a very clear status symbol to everybody, especially to all the older brothers, that Joseph is special and he doesn't have to do all the hard stuff that they do. And it's all because he's daddy's favorite. So the brothers don't appreciate it, and Joseph doesn't help matters at all when he starts telling them about the dreams that he's having about them all bowing down to him. And so one day when Jacob sends him out into the fields where his brothers are tending the flocks, they spot that fancy robe coming from a distance and they immediately decide to kill Joseph. They actually end up selling him so that they can get rid of him and make some money in the process. But they take that fancy robe and they dip it in blood and tear it up and send it back to Jacob. Genesis 37:32 says, "They sent the beautiful robe to their father with this message. 'Look at what we found. Doesn't this robe belong to your son?'" They don't even call him their brother. Joseph ends up being sold in the Egyptian slave market and purchased by a guy named Potiphar, who's a high-ranking official. And I assume it takes a little while for Joseph to acclimate, but he actually does quite well there. The Bible repeatedly tells us that God is with him, which would have to feel weird for someone to tell Joseph that, because from his perspective, he was ripped out of his life of leisure and luxury and now he's a slave. But when he looks back on it years later, he sees that God was with him and guiding him through all of this. He eventually becomes the head of all the servants. He's running the household until Potiphar's wife decides that she's got the hots for Joseph, and when he keeps denying her, she tries to force the issue. Genesis 39:12 says, "She came and grabbed him by his cloak, demanding, 'Come on, sleep with me.' Joseph tore himself away, but he left his cloak in her hand as he ran from the house." That cloak is his new wardrobe. Instead of having his fancy robe, he's reduced to the cloak of a slave. And because she doesn't want to be embarrassed as being someone who was denied by this slave, she comes up with a story that Joseph came onto her and tried to rape her, and when she screamed, he ran away but left his cloak there. So this thing that symbolized his role in that household is used to frame him, and it's used against him. So then Joseph ends up in prison for a while. Even in the prison, Scripture emphasizes again, God is with Joseph. And just like he did as a slave, he soon ends up basically running the prison. And I've got to skip ahead over the stuff of the other people having dreams and Joseph interpreting them, and then later Pharaoh has a dream and the guy finally remembers, oh yeah, there's this dude in prison who can interpret dreams, and they call for Joseph. Genesis 41:14 says, "Pharaoh sent for Joseph at once, and he was quickly brought from the prison. After he shaved and changed his clothes, he went in and stood before Pharaoh." This is just another wardrobe change going on with Joseph. But at this point, he's well aware that it's a costume, because who he really is the prisoner. But of course, yet again, God is with Joseph. And he interprets Pharaoh's dreams and goes even a step beyond that and advises him, which is shockingly bold for a prisoner slave to tell this all-powerful ruler what he should do. And that's just even more evidence that God is with him, because Pharaoh doesn't get offended and accepts the advice and decides to put Joseph in charge of carrying out that plan, which is why Genesis 41:42 tells us, "Then Pharaoh removed his signet ring from his hand and placed it on Joseph's finger." That's a sign of authority and power. He dressed him in fine linen clothing and hung a gold chain around his neck. That's a symbol of status. Joseph started out with this fancy robe that showed how special he was within the family and how much his father preferred him over everybody else. And it made him an outcast in the family to the extent that his brothers literally threw him out and sold him, and used that very robe to trick his father into thinking he was dead so no one was going to look for him. Then he had the simple clothing of a slave, and he eventually thrived in that position until that clothing was used against him and used to betray him and frame him. When he changed out of the prison rags into whatever nice clothes they gave him to stand before Pharaoh, that was like a pretend identity. Everybody there knew he had just been taken out of the prison, but they were making him look presentable. But in a matter of minutes, he was actually elevated way beyond everyone there except for Pharaoh himself, and adorned in finery and status and power. The obvious natural thing would have been for Joseph to to allow any of those different wardrobes to actually identify him, to shape his reality of who he was and how he perceived himself. But the truly special thing about Joseph is that he didn't. His identity was based in his relationship with God, the God who was with him in every step along the way. And so all these changing circumstances that are represented by the changing clothes, it changes the way other people saw him, but it didn't change the way Joseph saw himself. That's the lesson that we can all take from this. We can't control what our lives look like. We don't know the next thing that's going to come up tomorrow, but we can trust that God will be there with us in it, no matter what it looks like. As followers of Christ, we're told that he will never leave us or forsake us. He is with us just as much as he was ever with Joseph, and we can trust him the same way Joseph did, and let him define our identity. Let that be what drives who we are at our core. Our circumstances will always change, but God never does.